Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me well? Perfect. My name is Daniel Bates. I'm an engineer with Cisco Systems. I'm here today with Steph, my partner. I'd like to talk to you today about how we can get involved in the attacker's kill chain, which is the sequence of events that they are going to use to try to get malware into your systems and into your networks, how we can interrupt that kill chain and then prevent them from doing what it is they want to do. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Let me advance the slide here. We're going to cover 4 topics. The first is just a quick introduction to the 3 tools that I mentioned in the beginning: AMP, Threat Grid, and Umbrella Investigate. I'll talk a little bit about what they are. Some of you may be familiar with them, some of you may not be. So we'll try to get everyone onto the same baseline of what these tools are and how they work and what we want to use them for. Then I'll do a quick case study, a little bit of hands-on with how we would use these tools to proactively deal with a threat in a more simple manner. I know some customers have very large security environments, a lot of dedicated personnel. Other customers do not, right? So we try to have a solution that works across both of those environments. Then we'll take a short break, we can answer some questions, and then we'll dive into the more technical part of the day. We're going to talk about the kill chain itself and what the different steps are in that process so that we can better understand what we're going to try to do to defend against that type of attack. And then we're going to go into the real heart of the presentation is a more advanced case study in incident analysis, where I'm going to walk through some real-world malware and what we would do to find out the root cause and exactly what happened in the network and on that system, and then prevent it from happening again. So that's what I have on tap for you today. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. The first part is the introduction to the tools. So we're going to talk about 3 tools today: AMP for endpoints, Threat Grid, and Umbrella Investigate. You probably can't see the Investigate font very well here, but I promise it's there. AMP is actually a technology that works on a number of different platforms. You can put advanced malware protection on a firewall or an email security gateway or a web proxy. But today we're going to focus on the endpoint because it's most interesting to me when it is on the endpoint, when we can see inside the system and what files and processes are being interacted with at that point. So we're going to talk about that. Threat Grid is our sandboxing engine. That's what does our dynamic and static file analysis within that virtualized environment. We can get some very interesting information out of a sample when we run it through that type of product. And then Umbrella Investigate. How many of you have heard of Umbrella Investigate or have used it? Not so many people. Okay. Maybe 3 or 4. Well, that's good. So we will actually break some new ground for the majority of you and talk about what Umbrella Investigate is. How many of you have seen Umbrella or OpenDNS? Not the Investigate part, but the other part. A few more people, right? So there's quite a bit of advanced analytics that underpins that DNS layer protection service. And a threat analyst would have access to that using the Investigate console, which we will do today. So first, let's talk about AMP for endpoints. Now, we have a lot of technology at our disposal to deal with malware before it really becomes a problem, and that's the prevention phase of any type of malware-focused solution, right? You have to try to block attacks whenever you see them, and we have a lot of ways to do that. So we have what we call the detection lattice, or the prevention framework. There's 7 or 8 engines that we typically deploy to try to protect a system. We have quite a few engines because there's a lot of ways that malware tries to use to get onto a system. And if we focus only on one technique like machine learning or signature-based analysis, we're doomed to just being evaded constantly. So if we apply a bunch of different techniques, we have a better success rate. So talking about a few of the ones here, we have things like one-to-one signature matching. Skipping over the first thing there, purpose, so I'm going to come back to it. But one-to-one signature matching uses something like a hash of a file to get a unique descriptor of that file, and then it's going to take that hash and do a quick lookup against the AMP cloud, which has about 6 billion files in that repository. So if it's any of those 6 billion files, we know about it, we know whether it's good or bad, and we can treat it accordingly. It's a very quick, computationally inexpensive way to deal with a lot of threats that we have seen out there. Now, threats tend to change frequently, so you often have to go beyond that type of very static analysis and go into things like fuzzy fingerprinting with our file grouping engine. That's to deal with malware where the attacker might just insert a little bit of static code into their payload, into their binary, and then just skip over it at runtime. It's not going to change the way that the malware works at all, but it does completely change the hash, of course. So our file grouping engine is able to kind of look at that and find out that this file that we're looking at is very similar to another file we have seen. It's maybe a 95 or 98% match. So it's probably part of the same malware family. Machine learning, of course, we apply that very broadly within our analytics portfolio, also very specifically at looking at things like Microsoft executables. There's a lot of new ones out there. We want to get some zero-day insight into what they could be, whether they trend towards being good or being bad, without necessarily having to take the time to run them through a sandbox, which will take maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And as we proceed along this slide to the right, farther and farther away from real-time protection. So an indicator of compromise is something that we can look at to determine whether, apologize for the audio dropouts, I'm going to try to move my mic to the front, so hopefully this works. So indicators of compromise are, we call them synthetic events sometimes. So they're not necessarily a detection event. It's more you're seeing that something is happening. So how many of you have small children? I have one. A 4-month-old. He kept me up quite a lot last night. So when you have a small child, you kind of get to hear when they're not doing something, and that quietness is a little bit strange. Right? It doesn't mean that they're doing something bad or that something bad is happening, but it's an indicator of concern. So that's kind of what an indicator of compromise is. It doesn't necessarily mean that something bad is taking place. It could be completely benign, but it's something we want to look at. Of course, that processing takes a little bit. It's not necessarily a real-time thing. Same thing for device flow correlation. That's where we're using the network stack endpoint to try to look at what might be happening in terms of network telemetry. Maybe something is trying to beacon out. Maybe something's trying to call home or maybe exfiltrate something, so it might be reaching out to an IP address or a domain that we know about. Other types of analytics that we can apply within the AMP cloud, I'll talk them in a second, but they kind of get farther and farther away from what we would do, in terms of real-time protection. So this first thing that I kind of didn't really mention when I was talking about this is exploit prevention. I didn't talk about it because many of you probably haven't seen that before within the context of AMP. This just came into the product 2 days ago. So we've been that on the internal side with a beta for some time now, and it just came into the actual full console on the 5th. So if any of you are AMP customers, that's version 6.0.5. It's out today. It's a lot of fun. So that is, exploit prevention is a way to basically randomize is this better? All right, well, we'll work with this. So exploit prevention is a way to basically randomize how a application is being loaded into memory so that the application itself can operate just as it should, but attackers might not be able to interface with it or manipulate it or hijack it that would want to. The easiest explanation that I have for it is kind of like you have your house. It has doors, it has windows. You might try to come into that house through those doors and windows. Exploit prevention is like putting a big sheet of plywood in front of each door and window so you can't come in, and letting actual guests or whoever you want to enter the house to come in through the middle of a wall in the house next door. So no attacker would know that that entry point is there, but the program itself knows about it and works just fine. So it's a way of dealing with hijacking and things like Mimikatz and other kind of nefarious activity. This will make a little more sense here. So we have in-memory prevention, system protection, that's going to protect critical Windows processes like LSASS and so on from being hijacked. We have exploit prevention, which is for client applications like browsers and so on, and that's in memory, right? That can stop an attack before it even hits the file system. Once it's on the file system, we rely on things like our AMP cloud with all of its detection labs framework, which is the offline signature-based analytics engine. We have our custom detections that you can apply. And once we get past that, now we're into post-infection. That's that device flow correlation, that's cognitive threat analytics, which we're not really going to cover today. Indications of compromise, right? These are all things that are very helpful in figuring out what happened, but they're not really prevent something from happening necessarily. Which leads me to one of the first very important points of today. Prevention doesn't always work. I wish that I had a silver bullet that would totally blow away all pieces of malware for all time, right, and just solve the malware problem entirely, but that's just not realistic, and anyone who says that they have that for you is not being very truthful. But we have to go beyond prevention and be able to look at things when they do get in, and that's where we're looking back over time and trying to find out how something got into the system itself. So we do a number of things for that. We have something called a retrospective engine within the cloud that will compare how a file has been presented, so whether it's clean or unknown, and if it's been updated to be malicious. We'll process that as a retrospective action or a retrospective job, notify any connector that has seen that file that it's actually not a good file anymore. So that's the easy way to kind of get after something. We're going to look at this during the scenario here in just a second. Some other things within the AMP for Endpoints console. This is a bit of an eye chart, I apologize. Incident workflows. So if you don't have a workflow in place, the kind of information you're going to look for is going to take a lot of get it. So things like, what system is this that we're looking at? What policy is being applied to it? What group is it in? What's going on within this system? What are some possible vulnerabilities that might be present in this system? Right, the inbox feature is something that we have that will give that information to us. And then, of course, what are the next steps? Right, so if it's not immediately obvious what happened during this incident, we take some further action and look at the events themselves or look at the trajectory of the files and processes that were being acted upon. So that device trajectory is what will give us the context around a detection rather than just surfacing, we found this threat and we did this thing to it. We can find the unknown activity associated with something that we do know about. So for instance, here is a device trajectory for one of our common kind of test scenarios, and we have some red processes and files. Those are known as malware. We will quarantine those. And then there are some ones in gray, like the one that I have an arrow pointing to. That is a portable executable that was created by a malicious process. And it's an unknown executable because we've never seen it before and we don't have any information on it. It doesn't seem immediately suspicious except that it was created by a malicious program. So that right there is enough for me to probably want to take a second look at it. Right? But again, there's nothing about that file that would really raise my suspicions from that specific level of looking at that individual file. So that's where the device trajectory comes in. You can surface those kind of unknown things that are associated with a particular activity. Once you have that information, you can pivot into a file trajectory, and that collects all the information about a particular file within your system, within your network, so that you can see everything that it's been and what it's trying to do all in one place. That kind of is corresponding to our threat root cause, which is trying to show what is the attack surface here within your environment. What applications are introducing threats, mostly, and what can we patch that will give us the fastest return on our time investment, right? Because all of us have vulnerabilities in our systems. I have a couple of vulnerable applications running on my laptop right now. I should probably patch Java because I think we're up to update 153 in Java right now. I think I'm a couple of revisions behind, right? But not all of us have the time every single application across the network. So what can we do that will have the biggest impact on our security? And things like this threat root cause can kind of give us that idea. Low prevalence is another feature that we can use to get after malware. And this is one of our advanced analytics engines that's operating in the cloud. And the idea here is malware is actually not as common as we might think that it is. Malware is maybe 1 out of 1 million files or so in a typical environment. But if we look at those uncommon files, the ones that are only on 1 or 2 systems, than an entire enterprise, we can find malware much more quickly, much more effectively, because it tends to show up in that data set. So what this analytics engine does is it looks for how common an executable is within an environment. If it's on maybe just a handful of systems, then it's something we might want to take a second look at. And one of the things we can do with that second look is we can submit it to ThreatGrid for file analysis, right? That's what we call low prevalence automatic analysis, where if we come up with that interesting file or interesting executable, we can send it to the ThreatGrid sandbox, which I'll talk about in just a second. We can identify what it is based on its behavior, and we can convict it in route. So let's talk about ThreatGrid. How many of you are familiar with ThreatGrid or have used it or seen it before? A few people? All right, so ThreatGrid is something we acquired a few years ago, and what it does for us is it gives us that sandboxing capability. So we can play back an interesting file or an unknown file and see exactly what it is on the system or on the target system, so that we know, what it is based on that behavior. We have a number of interesting things with ThreatGrid based on the way it works, right? So we used to just have a US cloud, now we have a European cloud as well, which is good news for everyone here, so you don't have to be subject to those data privacy restrictions. Or that you can take advantage of those data privacy restrictions, rather. You don't have to ship all of your files back to the US. So what we're trying to do here is be scalable and be able to take in as many files as possible. We're dealing with about 3 to 4 million samples per day within this environment. So whenever we release a new feature, we have to make sure that it works very well across that platform. And it has to be able to scale. So the things that ThreatGrid does kind of under the hood are really 4 things. I'm going to talk about each of them here. The first is a kernel monitor. It functions kind of like a machine level debugger. What we're trying to do is take interesting actions that we can identify from within the kernel and map them to function names or symbol names. And this is what generates the raw data for our behavioral indicators, which I'll show you here in just a second. So if we find some interesting content within an argument or a function, we can extract that and report on it. The second thing is dynamic disk analysis. This is really the heart of what we're doing with ThreatGrid. So what it looks like inside the system is basically a queue full of RAM disk VMs. So we have a couple of master images of Windows that we use as our baseline. And they're replete with some maybe not so great client applications, some older versions of Java and Office, and things that we can use to let malware run and execute and do whatever it wants to do. So when we get a new sample and it hits the processing queue, we're going to spin up a new environment for it to live in for a short period of time. We will take a look at it as it runs, and because we do that forensic analysis of a virtualized disk, we can actually see everything that happens within that environment. So if the malware tries to modify the master boot record, or if it tries to do anything very clever and hide within a sector that's been marked as bad in the file system, that's typically invisible to anything that's inside that file system, but we can see it from the outside. We can see that damage that we call it, and we can walk that back to exactly what function caused that damage. So we get very good visibility into what a sample is trying to do. We can also do some interesting things inside the VM itself. So we have a set of functions called cloak and dagger. Cloak is there to hide the system. One moment. So cloak is there to hide the dagger portion. Dagger is essentially a rootkit that we can run inside the sample itself, and it can do some things for us, like if a sample is trying to evade detection by sleeping for a period of time. A lot of malware is going to try to evade that sandbox by pausing itself for maybe 6 hours or so, because obviously we can't wait for 6 hours for a sample result to come back. So what we can do is we can see that, we can intercept that call, we can modify it so that it will sleep for a more acceptable time, like 30 seconds, and then we can let it continue to run. So it will think that it's doing whatever it was designed to do. It doesn't know any better, but we're actually able to watch it. We can also reset things like SSL keys so that we can see encrypted streams as they're being written to the buffer, and so on. And then finally is artifact static analysis. I know it's shocking, but malware is not typically written to code or any type of usable standard. They kind of develop whatever they want to do and however they want to do it. So it's often really difficult to identify what a particular file is just based on the file magic or whatever kind of static structures that we've used to identify executables in JavaScript and so on. So we have a number of parsers that we can apply to kind of run the file through that set of engines, look at the headers, look at the content. That helps us to identify exactly what type of file it is that we're looking at. And all of this kind of goes into these behavioral indicators. We have 964 of them, or we did last night, so we might have a couple more today. The threat grid team is constantly adding new indicators to look for specific behaviors, such as this one up here on the screen is looking at specifically at evidence of a zero access version 2 infection. We have a lot of indicators set up to look for things like sandbox evasion. A number of ways to try to evade a sandbox, right? We talked about sleep timers, that's one. A lot of malware used to try by looking for a virtual environment. So if it found that it was running inside KVM or inside VMware or any kind of space that had been fingerprinted to belong to a threat researching company like Cisco or Mandiant or Blue Coat, it would just shut down. It wouldn't do anything. Well, we can see that activity. We can see those function calls where it's looking for that information. And that in and of itself is an indication that something might not be great about this particular application. So that's Threat Grid. Now we'll talk about Umbrella Investigate to round out the tools discussion. Now, Umbrella or OpenDNS is something that many of you have probably seen before. It's essentially a DNS resolver. So just like the one that you're probably using today, if you're using maybe Google's resolver or your ISP's resolver, it does the exact same thing. You ask it for the IP address that it corresponds to a particular domain. But what we can do with OpenDNS or with Umbrella now is we can apply security to that. So if a client is trying to resolve a malicious domain, instead of resolving it, we will just return a block page. Now the data that underpins that capability is really what feeds into this investigate threat hunting console. And it really is all about the data. We have about 25 data centers throughout the world that are dealing with about 100 billion DNS requests every day from our 85 million users or so. We have peering relationships with over 500 other ISPs and content delivery networks so that we can exchange and look at kind of the architecture of the internet as a whole to give us visibility into infrastructure as it comes up. Which is a really massive amount of data. And the security research team is able to use that data, build some models to classify it, which I'll show you in a second. There's some very interesting models that they've developed to try to identify what a malicious domain is and what it might look like. And those models are what we use to actually apply kind of the predictive analysis so that we don't have to rely on a static feed of bad IPs and bad domains. So the first one is called co-occurrence. And this is looking at the relationship between domains that you request. So let's say that you load up a shopping website and it might have some advertisements on it. Your browser is going to resolve the first website, the parent domain, and then it's going to resolve the advertising domains as well to display the advertisements to you, because they're going to be hosted on different servers. And we can see that based on the relationships between the data that we're seeing as an aggregate. So if we see a large number of requests that are immediately followed with another request for another domain, we can kind of tie those together into a co-occurrence. And if the first one was malicious, the next one might be as well. This helps to identify families of domain names. There's another one, this is my personal favorite just because of the name, the spike rank model. If we graph out DNS requests over time in volume, it looks kind of like a sound waveform. And different attacks have different waveforms. So an exploit kit looks a little bit different than a phishing attack, which looks a little bit different than a domain-generated algorithm and so on. So if we see a new domain registered and we see the traffic going to that domain that looks like it's matching one of these attack types, we can stop it right there. We can block that new domain without it even having been fully turned on. We can also do things like predictive IP space monitoring, and that's where we'll take the fingerprint of a suspicious domain that we know about that's not very good, and we'll look at what it's running on, what IPs it's running on, what services the server is using, and basically enumerate what the hardware, the infrastructure is that's supporting that malicious domain. And then we'll apply that fingerprint and look for anything else that might be running that shares that same fingerprint, which is probably also bad. So we'll block those related domains. This is one of the ways that we can get after an attacker's infrastructure. They will try to dynamically create new domains to serve malware, but often they're using the same set of servers. So we can identify them that way. Another technique or another model for analysis is geolocation analysis. So we can look at where the server is in relation to its clients. So if content is being hosted across 20 or 30 different locations, that's not very normal. That's more typical of a botnet, which tends to host its own attacking infrastructure from the botnet hosts themselves. So that's out of the ordinary. Or conversely, we can look at if maybe there's a particular domain that's only serving clients in a very, very different country. Right? So in this example, there's a Russian top-level domain that's serving only American clients. That's a little bit strange, a little bit out of the ordinary, so that might flag a particular domain within the model itself. Now, in terms of using the Investigate console, we're going to show you what that is, and it's going to make a little more sense when we do that, because watching me talk about it's probably not very illuminating. But the key difference between ThreatGrid and Investigate from a threat hunting perspective is what data we're trying to get after. ThreatGrid is very, very good at looking at files and processes and things that you can see running on a system, whereas Investigate is more looking at the attacker's infrastructure, their services and what they're using to deploy the malware. And you can bounce back and forth between them very, very easily. So for instance, it really depends on where you start. If you have, let's say you have an IP address and a domain name, you can plug that into ThreatGrid and look for any malicious files or samples that have reached out to that domain. And that can lead you on a very interesting chase. Or you can plug that into Investigate and you can look for the infrastructure that's behind that bad IP and bad domain and find interesting things there as well. So as we go through the advanced hands-on portion, we're going to be looking back and forth between Investigate and ThreatGrid to kind of get an idea of what is happening within that particular attack. But before we get there, take a quick detour and look at this automated or proactive breach remediation. This is going to center around AMP for endpoints and the retrospective capability. This is a previously unknown malware variant that we're going to look at where AMP is detecting a suspicious file name that's being used by an executed file. So we're going to submit that file to ThreatGrid for investigation based on its low prevalence score. It's not very common, so we're going to look at it a little bit further. ThreatGrid is going to determine that it is malicious, and then we're going to quarantine it. So here is the malicious file itself, report.pdf.exe. The default Windows behavior here is to hide the well-known extension .exe. So the user is going to see report.pdf. And right, they might, if they're not very technical, they might not really realize that this file has an extension and none of the other files within their environment do. They might just say, oh, it looks like a PDF. And the attacker could be even more clever and give it the icon of whatever the PDF handler is on that system, so Acrobat or something like that. And then most users will probably say, oh, this is a PDF, let me go ahead and open that. Well, it's not, it's an executable. But the key thing here is this is a completely unknown file that no one has seen before, so there are no signatures that will pick it up. And for the purposes of my demonstration, there are no other more advanced techniques that will pick it up either. Now, if we look at the timeline of events here, just to give you an idea of how this is happening. So at roughly 1 o'clock, we start the download. And it comes up as an unconfirmed CR download within Chrome. Shortly thereafter, about 1 second later, it completes the download, and then it executes about a minute later. Very shortly after that, about 1 second after that, we trigger an indicator of compromise based on that suspicious behavior. So this is our fake extension executed indicator of compromise that just says that there's a second extension that doesn't look right. Now, sometime later, some time passes, and the low prevalence algorithm picks this up as an interesting file. This is an executable that's not seen anywhere else. It's worthy of some additional analysis. So we'll take a look at it. We'll submit it for dynamic analysis to ThreatGrid, and the disposition is shortly thereafter updated to malicious because it's definitely not a good file. So the total time that elapsed between when we first saw it hit the network and when we quarantined it is 3 hours and 42 minutes and 53 seconds, which might seem like a long time, but think about what happened here. This is a completely unknown file, had never been seen before, and was automatically quarantined within a matter of hours. And this takes place without any administrator intervention at all. So you don't have to be there to, to tag it as malicious or to blacklist it or do anything of the sort. And this is really good for the customers that I to are very small and may have just 1 or 2 people handling all of the IT for that entire organization. I don't know if any of you kind of fit into that category. I used to work myself before I came to Cisco, and there's just not enough time in the day to do a really deep analysis of every single piece of malware that comes into an environment. So you have to have something that can take action on its own and deal with something in a more proactive manner. Now I'm going to do something that I probably shouldn't try to do, but I'm going to try to show you this live. So bear with me for just one moment. All right, and that is the end of the first part of the presentation. So before we go into the second part, I want to take a few minutes, give everyone a little break. You've heard my voice for already, so grab some coffee maybe. If there's any questions at all about what we've covered so far, I'd be happy to answer them. And if not, we'll see you again in maybe 5 minutes. All right, hello everyone. Hopefully the break was good. I got some coffee. I think I took the last of it. I apologize. It's about 3 in the morning for me on East Coast time for the US, so I'm getting there. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the kill chain model. We teased a little bit about it in the beginning, but I want to dive a little more into what the kill chain is and how it works and why we care about it before we go into the hands-on portion, which is really going to take up most of the rest of the time here. So has anyone seen or used the kill chain concept before? Awesome. I get to be the first to talk about it to you. So this is the kill chain. This was developed by a company called Lockheed Martin a while back, and then I adapted it somewhat so that the terms are a little bit different from the ones they used, but the basic idea is the same. The concept is any attacker has to go through a particular set of procedures to get malware onto a system successfully. And those are roughly the same throughout, any type of malware. So right now I'd like us to all put on our black hats for a brief period of time and try to think like the attacker. And what they would try to do and how they would try to do it. So the first stage within the kill chain is recon or reconnaissance. And that's where the attacker is trying to figure out how to get into the network or how to get into your system. To do that, they have to know what your system is and what that network is, right? They're going to do a lot of very in-depth reconnaissance of the target before they move into the actual exploit phase. So in terms of a timeline, this could take weeks, this could take months. In some cases, this takes years. They're doing some very painstaking analysis of exactly who you are and what types of equipment you use. They could be doing things like social media, looking at job postings to find out what your infrastructure is. So if you're asking for, an administrator, hopefully not off the microphone too much. So if they're looking, if you're out there looking for a Linux administrator, then they might want to start brushing up on their Red Hat or Linux exploits. If you're looking for someone who has a lot of experience with ASA firewalls, then they can start dusting off their libraries of how to go through the firewall and so on. So there's a lot of information that they can get from open source methods. Just by Googling you and finding out other information about you. And then there's, of course, the more classic reconnaissance techniques of, going through and looking at what services are open in your IP space, doing some banner grabbing, trying to find out exactly what is open within your environment or what they could use as a foothold. And once they map those things out, of course, they know what they're going after, which could be data, it could be access, or some type of privileged credential. They're going to try to map out how to get there as best they can, right? Are they going to come in through straight in through the front door, or are they going to try to use an alternative means? Did anyone hear about the Target breach from, I think it was 2013 or thereabouts? A large retailer in the U.S., quite large. In just about every city, and they had a massive data breach where the attackers came in and got away with a lot of cardholder credentials, credit card records. And the way the attackers came in was actually through an HVAC system and through some controllers. So they didn't go directly into the network, but they got onto the network by leveraging some access that they got off of a contractor. They got into the HVAC systems. The HVAC systems were, for some reason, connected to, in a roundabout way, to the actual card processors. Not great segmentation. So they were able to use that to get into the network itself. And then that story has repeated numerous times by how to get in and then just doing that. Recon stage. That's where they're going to find out everything about you and then plan out exactly what they're going to do. The next stage is, staging. That's where they're going to figure out, based on their knowledge, how best to get into your environment. So, what type of exploit are they going to try to use? How are they going to get it there? They're going to get their own infrastructure ready. So that might be developing their own malware dropper. Or developing their own malware, right? If they don't want to use an off-the-shelf exploit. They could be standing up their own domains, their own infrastructure for delivering the malware to you, doing a lot of that type of preparatory work as well. So this is all before the attack even hits your perimeter, right? There's not a whole lot that you can do about it at this point, but I don't want to get ahead of myself and start thinking about defense. I want to keep thinking about how the attacker is functioning, right? So let's move into the launch stage. This is, in terms of a timeline, right, where recon was weeks or months or even years, staging was maybe days or weeks. Launch is seconds, just seconds at a time. And that's where they actually get the exploit started into your environment. So that's going to be sending you that phishing email, or doing that initial breach of your network to get the initial dropper there. Exploit is when they move into the more technical phase, and that's where they're going to use whatever techniques that they developed through the staging phase and whatever access they were able to see using the recon stage. They're going to put those together, and they're going to breach the system wide open. They're going to escalate to whatever level of privilege they need. They're going to be able to set themselves up for the next phase, which is installation. At install, that's where they go and deploy all of their hooks, their stage 2, their payload, and they do all the preparation for actually getting the data or access out of the system, or whatever they want to do with it. Of course, at callback, that's where they communicate back and forth with the implanted malware. They might be trying to exfiltrate data at this stage. They might be giving it further instructions. If this is ransomware, this is where the ransomware itself will exfiltrate the encryption key so that they can decrypt your files if you choose to pay the ransom. And other things can happen at this stage. Notably, this is where we can see that outbound or inbound traffic from a firewall or an endpoint perspective. And then, of course, persist. If an attacker is going to go to all the trouble of breaching your network, they're not going to throw it away once they get what they came for. Typically, they're going to leave some backdoors in your environment so they can come back and check on you in 6 months or a year and see if you've developed any other intellectual property that they would like to acquire. Or they might just hand over access to your system to a third party, maybe a coworker, or just sell it on the black market. This is actually often where we discover attacks, is in this persist phase, where a very stealthy attacker can get in, get what they want, turn the system over to someone who just wants it to farm Bitcoin, and we discover it at that point because it's a very noisy attack. When we do the analysis, we find out that that was not the first attack. There was actually quite a lot going on as well. All right, so let's flip this over a little bit and talk a little bit about how we what each stage of this process. So at the recon stage, you probably can't see a lot, right? You can't detect someone Googling you or looking you up on Facebook. You can detect some reconnaissance activity like ping sweeps. In fact, you all are getting actively reconned at this very moment. If you don't see any activity of recon within your firewall logs and your IDS logs, what's probably happening is you don't have internet. I'm getting reconned all the time at my home network. Not generally successful attempts, but there's always going to be someone running some type of internet-wide scan of just every open port, running through all of the IPv4 address space, knocking on ports, and just doing random things to try to get into open systems. So that's always going to happen. At the staging portion, again, you can't really do much as a customer at this point. However, as a vendor, we can do a little bit with things like OpenDNS or Umbrella. We can see some of that attacker's infrastructure being spun up if they're creating and registering new domains, or they're using a domain generation algorithm to stand up new infrastructure. We can see that, and we can start to block it proactively. But otherwise, this is all going to happen on the attacker's timetable and in the attacker's own kind of network. With launch, so that's how the initial infection gets into your network. So this is where we can start to play with it a little bit. Now, email used to be the #1 threat vector for malware. And then a couple of years ago, it kind of transitioned to web, malvertising and hijacking and drive-by downloads. And then it actually came back to email again, thanks to ransomware. There's, I think, about 60 to 70% of spam that has a file attachment is actually a version of Locky ransomware. It's an incredibly prolific piece of ransomware, and it's just one of several. So email is probably one of the most common type of malware coming in, either as a link or as an attachment. This is our first chance to actually kill it, right, with either Umbrella or AMP or something like that. Now, the exploit, right, that's the vulnerability that they're using to get in there. That could be an internet-wide exploit, like, remember Heartbleed? That was Not very fun. It could be an application vulnerability. It could be a layer 8 vulnerability. Anybody take a guess what a layer 8 vulnerability is? That's your users. They are very vulnerable. We should patch them. All right, the installation. Again, we can see this as well. The code from the exploit itself is typically very, very small. It's very specialized. It's very lightweight. Its only purpose is to get that exploit, to pop that vulnerability, to get something on your system. The next step is usually a little bit bigger and easier to detect. It's not very frequently a custom thing. A lot of attackers are not going to go to the trouble of creating their own keylogger or payload. They'll just acquire one that we may have seen before. So of course we can see all this activity with the tools that we have. At callback, very obviously we can see that network traffic from the firewall or if we can identify it either based on its content or based on its destination, any of those relationships, we can see that. And then, again, with persistence, that's the more interesting one. So it depends on what the attacker is trying to do. If it's just kind of a smash and grab and the attacker is trying to get it and turn it over to someone else, we can identify that. But to really identify a persistent threat is going to take some type of behavioral monitoring or some type of well-done segmentation. So if you have behavioral analysis with something like StealthWatch that can look at net flows over time and see evidence of maybe a persistent outbound connection to a destination that you don't really do any business with, that could be one way of seeing persistence in action. Does everyone feel pretty good with the kill chain so far? All right. Now let's have some fun with it. As I'm getting this set up, any questions about kill chain or anything that we covered so far? No questions? I'm either really bad. Hopefully good. All right, so this case study is going to focus on some real malware. I downloaded this last night, so it's fairly fresh. And we're going to see what we can see about it. But before we begin, it really all starts with some type of event. That's really what's going to kick off this incident response process, which is where we're trying to come in, we're going to figure out what happened. So these are all examples of events that you might see within your network. Some of those are Cisco products, some of those are not. But each of these could be the motivation or the reason why you would come in and try to do something with that particular situation. We actually have 3 types of events. Green. First type of event is a detection. So that is a one-to-one match with something that we know about. That could be network traffic, so your IPS logs, logging some type of intrusion event. I'm constantly getting Internet Explorer invalid text node creation argument attacks against my Apple iPad, which I think is amusing. It's probably not going to work. Or it could be like a malware file that we identify. The second event type is an indicator of compromise. Like we mentioned before, this is not a specific breach or piece of malware or anything that we can very specifically tie to. It's just more just some type of situation that's not very good. This could be happening on the endpoint. This could be from a cloud analysis. We're looking at things like there's named pipe up there in the top right where something is trying to use pipes, which are the ways that processes communicate with other processes within Windows. It's trying to take one over and use it to escalate its privileges to kind of become whatever it's trying to talk to. One of several techniques that we can identify as an indicator of compromise. And the third part, the one that I think is most interesting, is a side channel notification. That's my own term for it. And that's where you use some other type of product or maybe baseline monitoring, or one of your users comes up and says, I'm seeing a lot of dialog boxes opening on my system and lots of things that are scrolling by very quickly. I'm not really sure what's happening here, right? That's a very interesting indicator that something's probably happening on their network or on their system. So that's where we would come in, and that's where we would kick off this incident response process. Now, I'm going to try to do this live again. So I'm going to take a moment to get this set up. All right, there we are. So unfortunately, this is going to be a little bit difficult to read at times. So I would just ask if you could bear with me. Hopefully that stays this time. All right, so what we're looking at, again, is our dashboard. I'm starting out at the inbox rather than the actual dashboard itself, because the dashboard is what contains the heat map that's going to show us, which organizational group or population is having the issue. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I have identified there are 2 systems within my network that appear to be having problems today. There's actually quite a few more, but I'm really just focused on these 2. And what I want to do is look at the compromised artifacts up there in the top right. So I can see that there is a file that's been identified. There's 2 instances of it within my network. Coincidentally, there's 2 systems under investigation. And it's something that's malicious. It's a Word document. It says it's an invoice, and then there's some numbers, and then the .doc extension. And that's one of my in-progress events right there. It looks like it's taking place within my contractor user group and my employees user group. So if I scroll down a little bit, I will see those events here. So here's the system, the PC in the contractors group, and then here's one in the employees group. And it looks like the exact same thing probably happened on both. So AMP is showing me a little bit of information that I can use to kind of orient myself to what I'm looking at. This can be helpful if I'm dealing with one of my executive systems, maybe my CEO's, fairly important. The access or privileged information, whereas if I'm dealing with a very locked down kind of guest system that doesn't connect to anything at all, I might deprioritize that a little bit. So knowing which group or policy is applied to a system can be helpful to identify which one you want to go after first. In this case, I'm going to go after the first one first. I'm going to let AMP kind of pick this one for me. And I can see that there was a threat that was identified. If I click on this, I can see exactly what it was. There's a malicious file, like we saw before. There's also a vulnerable application that we have identified running within this environment. All right, so we talked about that a little bit. I'll expand on that just now. So AMP is able to look at applications that are running within your network or on your systems and identify if any of them have reported vulnerabilities, or CVEs. The industry tends to call them CVEs and assign them a unique number. So in this case, Windows Word 2010 has 14 vulnerabilities in it. One of them was probably used in this type of attack. So we're probably dealing with something along those lines. So now that we have a quick introduction to what's happening here, the next thing I'm going to go into is my device trajectory. And that should be here. This one I am going to zoom in on because it's fairly important. All right, that should work better. Can everyone see that okay? All right, good. So this is, how many people have seen a device trajectory before? Just a couple. All right, so what this is showing is the relationship between files and processes on this system. So there are a number of good ones and bad ones on the left-hand side, and then there's the timeline down at the bottom, and I can look at different types of events just based on their icons. So the very first event in the very top left is it looks like a magnifying glass, and that's a file scan. Then there's some other kind of administrative tasks that happened, and then the interesting things here are there's a green line connecting the green explorer.exe process. It's green, which means we know it's good. It's been signed, it's been cryptographically verified. It is the legitimate Windows tool, explorer.exe. And that is interacting with a zip file and a red detection. Anything in red is bad. So this invoice. And you can see that it's actually creating both of those. So like someone just opened the zip, unzipped it, and then opened the document inside it, which is exactly what happened, which I did. So Explorer opens those, creates or opens that malware up, and then we see a yellow box that's running down vertically, coming from this icon here, which is an indication of compromise type of event. It's actually detecting the vulnerabilities within Office 2010. There's the number of CVEs. There's 14 of them. You can look up each one individually if you want to really read into, exactly what CVE 2015-1682 was. I will not do that. It's a little bit boring. But this is what tells us that the word was executed at this time to open the document, and it was potentially a vulnerable application. So there's a little bit of a time skip here. The next event is this outbound connection. So this is our device flow correlation at work. We're looking at how this document or process is communicating with other internet resources. So in this case, PowerShell is communicating to a domain name that I cannot pronounce over port 80. PowerShell should not be making outbound HTTP requests to strange Netherlands domains, typically. That's not how I want my network to run. So that's something interesting. We're going to come back to that. There is another event that reaches out to a static IP address, and then there's another outbound connection to another very interesting domain name that I cannot read over port 80. And if I click on this one, it'll just give us some more information about it. There's the top level domain. Here's my request to log in again. We are very secure. Pardon me for a second. As I'm sure everyone here who has ever done a presentation knows, you've never logged out of an application more times than when you're trying to show it to someone. For anyone who's using AMP and has two-factor authentication turned on, this is a very, very helpful checkbox. It should not ask you for identification again for 30 days if you do it right. All right, I am having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to go back to the boring version of this, and we'll see if we can make do with it for a minute. All right, so we're looking at this device trajectory. Let me switch this over so you can see it. All right, so we had just finished looking at the third outbound network communication, which is the circle with the little kind of harpoon-shaped icon inside it. At that point, we see PowerShell creating the next file, which has a name. It's called specsystem.exe. It's in gray, which means it was unknown at the time that it was executed. That's going to change shortly, but it's creating it twice. It's executing it 4 times with some type of command line argument as context. It's passing it a system variable. And then that application is reaching out to the internet to static IP addresses that have been hard-coded inside it, and it creates another application, which is something I can't pronounce either, but that executes with command line context and then reaches out to the internet and so on and so forth. And that is the infection here. So what we're dealing with is a Trojan that was introduced using this dropper file, which is the document. So that is what the user opened. That is what initiated all of this. It actually came in through a VBA macro within Office. I don't know why anyone uses those anymore, except for malware authors. They're very, very helpful to them. This is what it actually this is the dropper file itself. It's a little bit clever. Because it runs a macro, most typical versions of Office are going to tell the user that those macros have been disabled. So this is just trying to look official and trick the user into opening this and executing it. I've seen some very interesting pictures in these types of documents that try to mimic exactly how Office functions and how it looks and try to look like a system notification or something that might be coming up. But they all do about the same thing. So it's going to run a macro. And this is what's going to come back from ThreatGrid based on the macro. There is a number of indicators signaling a high likelihood of malware. I'm going to see if I can get into ThreatGrid here because this is really fun to look at. All right, so this is the actual threat grid report itself. Now, many of you probably have not seen the threat grid portal. This is called Panacea. Quick sidebar, every AMP device can submit files to threat grid for sandboxing in slightly different ways. Right? Your dynamic file analysis policy, so it can identify interesting file types. If you want to sandbox any binary or executable, you can do that, and so on. AMP for endpoints can submit those low prevalence files. But if you want to have full access to threat grid, you can do Panacea, and that lets you do very interesting things like submit it with arbitrary or almost arbitrary runtime. You can interact with the sample as it is run box environment. So you can see a lot of interesting things as you do that. The report that you get has all the same information. You ran that from the AMP appliance or from threat grid itself, but it looks prettier from this side, so this is what I'm doing. And we can see exactly what this piece of malware was doing, what its behaviors were. So it's trying to modify a system file. It's using some interesting command line arguments. It's got a VBA macro that's randomly generating variables. It's got PowerShell with obfuscating command line. That's what it's trying to run right there. So those are just the very high priority indicators. Each one of those by itself would be enough to convict this as a bad file. And again, this is the dropper, which we detected as malicious. Some of you may be asking why we didn't quarantine it immediately. I did not allow AMP to quarantine anything on this system so that we could just go through and see what happened. Some people do run their connectors in audit mode, which generates that telemetry but does not quarantine things just for operational reasons, and so they would actually see this in life. So since I am possibly still logged in, let me switch over to my network tab. So this is where we can see some of those outbound network communications that were coming out of the sandbox environment itself. So the interesting ones here are, these might look familiar. That's the first domain that the dropper reached out to, Netherlands one. And this is the second domain that it tried to reach out to, both over port 80. The interesting is the request and response. For this particular one, it's asking for something and it's coming back with an application, an executable. So it's actually pulling down a payload from this web server. That's what it reached out to, and that's what it came back with. This is it's an application in an octet stream. So that's interesting. And what's actually happening here, if I go back to my boring presentation, right, that you would see from the device trajectory. When you expand on that network connection record, you can see that it's requesting something, it's requesting from that particular path. If you actually went to that website and went to that, that extension, this is what would happen to you. It's downloading a file. Now, in the initial dropper, it's going to do that silently. It's going to do that through PowerShell. But that is the actual stage 2 part of the malware right there. So that's coming down from the attacker's infrastructure. At that point, we can switch over to investigate, and we can take a look at what that domain looks like. So let me see if I can show you what investigate would actually show you here. All right, this is the Investigate console. You just put in whatever domain you want to research, or really anything. You can put in an IP address or just about anything. And if it's in the database, we will show you some information about it. So this one is currently in the block list. This actually changed a little bit from last night. This was an interesting domain. The predictive models had not flagged it initially. It actually had a fairly reasonably good predictive score. So we actually thought, just based on the data, that it was possibly an okay domain. But because it was correlated with a piece of malware that ran from threat grid, and the threat grid sample reached out to this domain and downloaded additional malware, based on that behavior, Umbrella flagged it as bad and put it in the block list anyways. And you can see here there is the graph of what the DNS request volume looks like. So it really didn't do anything very much until it was kind of turned on a little bit for testing in late November, and then it really became live here in December, and it looks like it's kind of tapering off because most security companies have seen this particular threat and blocked it already. But this is the lifespan of this particular threat. In about a week, it's going to get shut down completely. The domain name will get deregistered. It's going to resolve back to a local host, and it will go away. So you can see some information here, like the Whois record database. So I can see which email address registered it, what the name server is. There's a little bit more information here that I can pull up from the contact. Now, I don't want to mislead anyone here. Attribution is very, very, very difficult. So just because it says it's coming from someone in China and it appears to give a person's name, that does not mean that that's the person who attacked me. Clever people can very easily proxy their domains and their malware through unsuspecting people. So I don't want anyone to use this tool and then go, you know, book an airline ticket to China and knock on this person's door. That might not end well. But this can be interesting because some malware authors are a little sloppy and they might let something go. So there have been instances where someone used their personal Gmail address when they created something, right? And then that's just sloppy. Or maybe they create something and they reuse some part of their infrastructure or their domain registrar or anything like that. If they don't have very, very good operational security, we can tie those things together based on, you know, a previous sighting. So this can be helpful for that, even though I don't think anyone actually lives here. I'm not going to call those phone numbers. So these are the associated samples that we have picked up. And this is that linkage between Umbrella Investigate and ThreatGrid, where each of these samples within ThreatGrid reached out to that particular domain at some point. Two of them have very high threat scores. We actually just looked at one of them, the one that says Doc Dropper Agent. The one in the middle, that was the ThreatGrid report we just looked at. The last one that has a fairly low score of 60 is when I ran the website itself in the sandbox to give you that video of what the download looks like. It didn't do very much. It just downloaded. I didn't let it execute. It's currently registered as malware. It has been since yesterday. And there's some more information here that I'm not going to go into about what the models are coming back with, whether we think that it's a domain-generated algorithm, which is not, where the requesters are coming from geographically, you know, how they're being distributed. So there's some ranking and scoring going on here that kind of underpins the predictive modeling. And then you can see what its IP addresses are, you know, what it's been hosted on over time. So it kind of recently became hosted on this particular name server, and I could look this up and see if there's other malicious domains, or if I just want to, you know, blacklist this IP address. It's being delivered by these name servers and so on. So that's what Investigate would give me out of this type of tool. So here's the very interesting information, right? It's on the block list. That's what the DNS request spike looks like. These are the associated samples. And then I have some Whois information, just the raw data up here on the top left. So you can see where it's coming from. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is take those associated samples from ThreatGrid. It's giving me some hashes that I can look at. I'm going to go back to AMP for endpoints, which doesn't like me today, and plug that hash into my Elasticsearch box. And that's going to look across my entire infrastructure for anything that has seen that hash. And it's going to pull up information like these two systems, which we had looked at from the inbox. Those are my two test systems there. It's also going to pull up global file analysis results. So you can see at the very bottom, there is a file analysis result from ThreatGrid. So I would be able to access that from AMP for endpoints, even if I don't have a standalone ThreatGrid account. And that's all in one place. So that's very convenient. Now I know that this is on just these two systems. It hasn't been seen anywhere else within my environment. So this is helpful to get the footprint of that infection. If I look at the actual binary itself, right, I'm going to see what this is. So if I take that dropper file, the one that we downloaded but didn't do anything with, if I run that through the sandbox, it's going to come back with a little more interesting information. We've fingerprinted it exactly, so we know what it is. It's the Emotet malware, which is a banking Trojan. There's some information there in the paragraph that describes how it works and what it does. There's a significant amount more information farther on in the actual analysis report itself. But that is kind of what we would do to chase down that infection. And you'll remember there were other domains that this thing looked up before it looked up this one that downloaded the malware. There was another one, a Netherlands domain. We would do the same process with that one, look it up and investigate. We would see what malware has been associated with that domain, and just kind of keep chasing this down until we're pretty confident we understand everything about this infection. Now again, I do want to reiterate, this is fairly advanced. This is not something that smaller organizations that don't have a full-time security staff are probably going to want to do. But a lot of the larger teams have a dedicated security office, will typically of analysis. So here's where we get into the so what, right? What do we do with this information? Because up until now, it's a very academic exercise that I think is interesting, but I'm a nerd. So not everyone really gets a lot of benefit out of figuring out exactly how this worked, right? This is where we do get the benefit. How do we reduce our attack surface? How do we remediate this threat? Well, obviously, all of the malware that we saw is tagged as malware in the AMP cloud. As soon as the threat grid report comes back and says this is malicious, AMP is going to update it as a malicious file, so no one else is going to be able to run that on their systems. Well, that's table stakes. Let's go a step beyond that. Let's look at the vulnerabilities, the exploit that was used to get this on the system in the first place. Right? Why was the Word document able to kick off a PowerShell script that reached out and pulled down the rest of the infection? It was one of these exploits here. So let's patch those. Let's use AMP to identify where that vulnerable software is within the environment, and let's roll out some patches for it. Let's also take advantage of a link that we have between Umbrella itself, the DNS layer protection, and threat grid. So we can block domains that were surfaced through threat grid and add them to our dynamic, our custom blacklist within Umbrella. So any sample that we run in our organization, it might be private to just us, right? So no one else can see that sample or the results of it, but we can take advantage of all the domains that were pulled up through that sample run, and we can block them for ourselves. All right, so what we're doing is we're breaking the kill chain in every way we can. So let's go through it again really. The information that we were able to pull out of this particular infection, right? We saw the attacker, who the attacker is, maybe. We saw the payload, exactly what it is. This is the banking Trojan. And we saw a picture of the attacker's infrastructure, which we can use to defend against further attacks coming from that threat actor or using that infrastructure that's been registered. So going through the attacker's actions in the light of the kill chain. For reconnaissance, right? How do we defend against reconnaissance? In this case, not much of a because they're going to be able to look you up. They're going to be able to identify that someone might be susceptible to a phishing attack that might be, in the form of a very interesting looking document. In the US, there's a very prevalent attack called W-2 fraud. It's actually just coming into season now. It's centered around the tax season, running from roughly New Year's to mid-April, where every employee has to file their taxes, and they get a document from their employer that states how much they earned and what their withholdings were. That document is typically delivered electronically. It's typically some type of PDF. A lot of attackers will make some malware and call it a W-2, which is the form, and then a lot of people will be like, ooh, a W-2, I can file my taxes and get some money, and they won't really think critically about it at that point. So that's a very common phishing type of attack. It probably doesn't have a lot of relevance here, but there's a number of ways that an attacker could use that concept to deliver something either kind of widespread throughout your organization or very targeted at a specific person. So that's reconnaissance. Typically, user education is what we would do to keep people from maybe posting a lot of online that could be helpful to the attacker. At stage, that's where we see the attacker's infrastructure getting spun up, right? This is where models come into effect. If they're using that domain generation algorithm to develop their hosting servers, we can probably identify them that way. The interesting stuff comes from launch and exploit and so on. So at launch, That's where we're going to see the initial payload come in. We did not actually see that today. We just saw it magically execute on the target system because I went out and I found this malware. But it's typically going to come in from an email attachment, right? A web request. Someone getting this email from somewhere. We can guard against that by having good perimeter security, having a good email security pipeline, treating that traffic properly, and making sure that anything that has a Word document with active macros at least gets sandboxed before it gets delivered. That would prevent this whole thing from happening in the first place. Right, we get to exploit. Again, we can prevent a lot of exploits just by today with patches. Much more difficult to exploit a modern operating system like Windows 10 is kind of a nightmare, actually, from the attacker's perspective. Windows 7 and XP were much easier. So if you keep up to date with your operating systems and your client applications and your versions, it feels like a constant, impossible task at times to keep up with it, but it really does pay off. You will avoid a lot of the crud that's floating out there on the internet. At the install stage, that's where we rely on our malware tools, on AMP, on OpenDNS, on Umbrella, so we can try to prevent that malware from being installed on the system in its various forms. So not just the initial dropper, but also the secondary executables that it spawned. Right? Those are also malicious executables. We can identify them. We can block them at that point. At callback, it was establishing those outbound connections to hard-coded IP addresses as well as to its infrastructure, that domain name that we looked up. So we're going to block those. We're going to use the linkage that we just talked about on the previous slide between threat grid and Umbrella so that any domain that's referenced from a malicious sample is going to get blocked within our environment. That's going to protect us against these callbacks. And then, of course, for persistence, what I would recommend is if you have any indication that something might be persisting on an environment, if you can, of course, wipe it, re-image it. That's the easiest way to get rid of something, no matter how persistent it is. Of course, that's not always feasible, so you're going to have to do a little bit of work from time to time. But proper use of a behavioral analytics tool like NetFlow Analyzer can definitely help, along with good segmentation. So if that person from human resources is making 5 GB downloads from a financial server and then exfiltrating it to China, we can identify that and we can hopefully block that before it happens. All right, and that is all of the content that I have for you today. So hopefully that was helpful, possibly even interesting, if I can hope. Any questions from anyone at this point? The floor is yours.